St. Xavier professor Robert Shapiro joins me tonight on the phone to talk more about this. First of all, Professor Shapiro, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, one question that I want to ask right off the bat here is, you buy the fact that this was an interrogation that went wrong in this part of the world under this kind of ruling leadership?
Well, something clearly went wrong. Whether this is a credible explanation for it is a different story. I mean, it doesn't sound like this makes a lot of sense, and it sounds like an attempt to paper over something that's very severe and very, very damaging to the Saudis.
Now, we heard the president say that he talked to the king and he said he didn't know anything about this. How likely is it, for all intents and purposes, a murder would take place without his knowledge?
Well, I mean, the king is more of a figurehead than perhaps we recognize. It's the prince that's been running a lot of the policy of the Saudis, but I don't believe it's credible in the end that the king would not know, unless the prince, MBS as they sometimes refer to him, is not disclosing to him what he was been up to. But clearly high up in the Saudi government, there are people that have been aware of this and have been in some ways participating in it, so it appears.
Now, we've heard some whispers from lawmakers about possible sanctions against the Saudis. Of course, this all happening as the Saudis have a $110 billion arms deal with the U.S. Do you foresee any sanctions against the Saudis, and do you think that arms deal will go through?
Well, it's possible that there'll be at least a hold on some of these things. The problem for the United States, and it's not just a problem of this administration, but it's more a problem of this administration, is that we've really taken sides with the Saudis in some of the greater debates and disputes that are going on in the Middle East. The Saudis have been we've been very, very close to the Saudis in almost all of the major developments there. And now we're in a position of having to chastise or severely punish, as the president said, a country that's been our close ally.
Now, a number of business leaders have pulled out of an economic meeting scheduled to happen in Saudi Arabia. J.P. Morgan Chase and the Ford Motor Company, just a few, to name a few, rather. Does that really make a difference? Does that send a clear message?
Well, it does send some message. The Saudis really crave a kind of legitimacy within the sort of the modern, the civilized world, and for everybody to now back out of this summit makes them look bad. It's definitely a black eye. Over time, it's unclear what kind of an impact this will have. I wouldn't be surprised to see these as temporary things, because the Saudis, for better or for worse, have been so much a part of the American and to some extent Western policy there. So these are temporary things. The question is whether there'll be any long-term impact.
Now, U.S.-Turkey relations haven't been good for a while, to say the least. And soon after all of this happened, the journalist went missing. We saw an American pastor tried, convicted of crimes, and released from house arrest and allowed back to go back to the United States. What does that signal to you?
Well, that definitely was an effort by the Turks to try to bring the United States over to its side. It was a gesture that we've been demanding, and in fact it imposed sanctions because they hadn't granted it. It was a gesture to us to kind of bring us over to their side. It was interesting that to see the Turks do this. I'm not sure exactly what their ambition is here in the long term. They've clearly gone out of their way to embarrass the Saudis, and they've also now sidled up to the United States in a way that hasn't happened in quite a few years. So things are shifting in the Middle East. The question is whether it will have to be a permanent shift or just temporary.
And we've heard the president use the same kind of language about believing dictators and strong-armed leaders when they deny something happened, like Russia's Putin, Kim Jong-un in North Korea. And by not condemning them publicly, does that send a signal that doing this kind of thing is okay?
Yes, I think it does. I mean, I think that part of the problem with just sanctioning this or allowing this to go on and saying, oh, gee, I believe it if it's denied, really allows people to deny things that really aren't deniable. I think the Saudis are now really feeling the heat because there's so much evidence that this was a high level thing that was endorsed by the Saudi government. And so they're trying to find a way to gracefully move out of it. I don't think they're going to find it. But what this does is encourages other people to make up stories to try to explain why bad things that they've done are not as bad as they seem or aren't their fault at all. And that's not a good thing. And it always goes on to some extent in foreign relations. But to have the United States endorse this kind of thing is not a good thing for our policy.
Professor Shapiro, I wish we had more time, but thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.